Stand on a hilltop 15,000 years ago. Below you, a river cuts through a valley. Beyond it, grassland runs to the horizon. No fence, no wall, nothing announcing you're now entering anywhere. The ground under your feet belongs to no one, or to everyone, which in practice is the same thing. You could walk in any direction for as long as your legs held out and never cross a border, never show a passport, never be told you don't belong. For roughly the first 290,000 years our species existed, that was simply the default state of the world. No countries, no nations, no borders, just land and people moving across it. Then, sometime in the last 5,000 years, someone invented an idea so powerful that 8 billion people now organize their entire lives around it. And most of them have never once stopped to ask where it actually came from. So how did humans invent countries? The answer isn't simple, and it doesn't begin where you'd expect. Start with what came before. Because for most of human history, the honest answer to where are you from wasn't a place. It was a family. For roughly 96% of our species' existence, people lived in small, mobile bands of 20 to 50 related individuals, with no permanent address and no fixed territory. You moved when the food moved. You belonged to a group of people, not a patch of ground. And that group held together because you personally knew every single person in it. In 1992, Oxford evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar proposed that the human brain has a hard cognitive ceiling on the number of stable social relationships it can track, roughly 150 people, a figure now known simply as Dunbar's number. Below that threshold, you can know who everyone is, who they're related to, who owes whom a favor, who's feuding with whom. You can govern an entire society through gossip and reputation, no formal structure required. Above that threshold, the system quietly breaks. Nobody can personally track 300 relationships, remember every grudge, every debt, every alliance. And once that system breaks, you need something new to hold people together, something bigger than a family tree. Think about what that means for the invention of the country. Every country on Earth today holds vastly more than 150 people. India has 1.4 billion, Iceland has 380,000, even Vatican City, the smallest recognized state on the planet, holds around 800 permanent residents. None of them can run on personal relationships alone. Every single one needs a structure. Dunbar's brain was never built to provide natively. The country is, in a very real sense, a workaround for a cognitive limit. But that workaround didn't appear overnight. It took thousands of years, and it began with a decision most people wouldn't even classify as political: the decision to stop moving. Around 12,500 BC, in the Levant, a culture archaeologists now call the Natufians did something genuinely unusual. They stayed put. Dorothy Garrod first identified them in 1928 at Shukba Cave in what's now the West Bank, and later excavations at Ain Malaha, led by Jean Perrot, starting in 1955, uncovered circular stone houses, grinding tools, storage pits, and formal cemeteries. These weren't temporary camps. They were year-round villages, built by people who decided a specific piece of land was home. And the detail that matters here is that they were still hunter-gatherers. Agriculture hadn't been invented yet. They settled down first and figured out farming later. Why does that matter? Because settling changes your entire relationship to the ground beneath you. Land you're passing through is a resource. Land you're settled on is an investment. You clear it, store food on it, bury your dead in it. And once your ancestors are buried somewhere, that ground stops being just dirt. It becomes identity. Archaeologist Colin Renfrew argued in a 1973 paper that Neolithic megalithic tombs across Western Europe functioned as territorial markers. Burying your dead somewhere was a way of telling everyone else that this land belonged to the people descended from those bones. The first border markers, in other words, weren't fences. They were graves. And that's the very first seed of a country. Not a law, not an army, a burial. But houses and graves alone weren't enough to bind large numbers of people together. For that, you needed something capable of connecting total strangers, people who'd never shared a meal or buried a relative in the same soil. You needed shared belief. At a site called Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating in 1995 and uncovered something that didn't fit the accepted timeline of civilization at all. Massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, carved with animal reliefs and arranged in circular enclosures, dated to roughly 9,500 BC, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 before the pyramids. And the people who built it weren't farmers. They were hunter-gatherers with no permanent settlement nearby, arriving from scattered bands across the region to build something monumental together. Schmidt's conclusion, before his death in 2014, rewrote a chunk of the archaeology textbooks. First came the temple, then the city. The desire to gather for shared ritual, to worship together, to feel part of something larger than a 50-person band may be exactly what drove humans to settle down in the first place. Religion came before agriculture. Belief came before borders. Dunbar's number tells us you can't personally know more than 150 people, but you can believe in the same God as 10,000 people you'll never meet. Shared belief was the first technology that let humans cooperate past the ceiling of personal relationships, and every country that has ever existed still runs on some version of that same technology. A shared story binding strangers together. At Göbekli Tepe, that story was carved into stone. Today, it's printed on a passport. But shared belief still doesn't make a state. For that, you need grain. Around 10,000 BC, in the Fertile Crescent, humans began domesticating wheat and barley. Geneticist Manfred Huhn's team traced the domestication of einkorn wheat using DNA fingerprinting published in Science in 1997 to the slopes of Karakada in southeastern Turkey, just 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe. Agriculture changed everything, and not simply because it produced more calories. Yale political scientist James C. Scott, in his 2017 book Against the Grain, makes an argument most people have never encountered. The first states formed specifically around grain. Not rice, not yams, not cassava. Grain, because grain is visible. It ripens all at once, on a predictable schedule, and can be measured, divided, stored, and moved. In short, grain can be taxed. A yam growing underground is invisible. You can leave it in the soil and dig it up whenever you like, and nobody walking past your field can count your yams. Wheat stands in a field, ripening in plain sight, and anyone with eyes can estimate the harvest. Scott's argument, essentially, is that the state, the thing that would eventually become a country, is at its core a grain tax collection operation, and everything else, the borders, the armies, the bureaucracies, the laws, exists to make that taxation possible. Every passport you've ever held, every anthem you've ever sung, every war ever fought over a border, traces back in part to the simple fact that wheat is easy to count. But before you can tax grain, you need walls, and the oldest known walls on Earth belong to Jericho. Around 8000 BC, the settlement at Tel es-Sultan built a stone wall roughly 3.6 meters high and 1.8 meters thick, with an attached circular stone tower 8.5 meters tall and an internal staircase of 22 steps. Kathleen Kenyon, excavating in the 1950s, interpreted it as the world's oldest military fortification. Other archaeologists, including Harvard's Ofer Bar-Yosef, argued it was actually a flood barrier. Scott himself suggested early city walls may have been as much about keeping a labor force in as keeping enemies out. Early states needed to retain their populations for both labor and taxation. Whichever interpretation is right, building it required an estimated 11,000 person days of organized labor. Somebody planned it, somebody directed it, somebody fed the workers while they built it. That's not a family project. That's administration. And administration is the skeleton a country eventually grows around. Once you have surplus grain and walls to protect it, the next thing that inevitably follows is inequality. At Draa, in the Jordan Valley, archaeologists Ian Cuget and Bill Finlayson uncovered one of the world's oldest known granaries in 2009, dated to roughly 9,300 BC, complete with raised floors to prevent moisture and rodent damage. Someone understood food preservation 11,000 years ago. And whoever controlled that granary controlled the food supply. And whoever controlled the food supply held real power. Kent Flannery and Joyce Marcus, in their 2012 book, The Creation of Inequality, traced this exact sequence across multiple ancient civilizations. Egalitarian bands, they found, ran on what they called a logic of equality, leveling mechanisms like ridicule, gossip, and ostracism that kept any one individual from accumulating too much power. For tens of thousands of years, if you tried to elevate yourself to chief, your own community would simply mock you until you stopped. The shift toward inequality happened once sufficiently ambitious individuals figured out how to override those mechanisms, usually by claiming a special relationship with the gods, or by seizing control of stored surplus. Once temporary prestige hardened into hereditary rank, you were one step from a king. And once you had a king, you were one step from a kingdom, which is really just a country wearing a crown. But a kingdom of 200 people in a mud brick village still isn't a country in any modern sense. For that, you need a city. And the world's first true city is where the concept really starts taking shape. Around 3500 BC, in southern Mesopotamia, a settlement called Uruk began growing into something the world had genuinely never seen. By roughly 3100 BC, it covered more than 250 hectares, as archaeologist Robert McCormick Adams documented in his 1981 survey, Heartland of Cities. By any reasonable definition, Uruk was the first true city on Earth, and a city of tens of thousands of people has a problem. A village of 150 simply doesn't. You cannot run it on personal relationships. You cannot govern it through gossip. You need record keeping, standardized measures, a way to track who owes what to whom. So they invented writing. And here's the genuinely fascinating part. Writing wasn't invented for poetry, prayer, or philosophy. It was invented for accounting. The earliest known written documents are proto-cuneiform tablets from Uruk, dated to roughly 3,200 BC. Over 5,000 have been recovered, and more than 85% of them are administrative records, grain distributions, worker ration lists, livestock inventories. Denise Schmont-Besserat, in her 1992 book Before Writing, traced the entire evolution of written language back to small clay counting tokens used as early as 8,000 BC, which eventually became impressions on clay envelopes, which eventually became symbols pressed into flat tablets. The very first written word was almost certainly not God, love, or war. It was probably a number next to a picture of a sack of barley. The country, it turns out, was built on paperwork. Alongside writing, Uruk and related sites mass-produced crude, undecorated clay bowls of nearly identical size known as beveled rim bowls. Hans Nissen and Gregory Johnson argued these were standardized ration containers used by an early state bureaucracy to hand out precisely measured daily grain portions to workers. Same bowl, same amount, every single day. That's not hospitality. That's a payroll system, and a payroll system is a government. With writing and bureaucracy in place, real formal borders followed close behind. Around 2500 BC, two Sumerian city-states, Lagash and Umma, went to war over a strip of fertile land called the Guedna. King Masilim of Kish arbitrated the dispute around 2550 BC by surveying the land and erecting an inscribed stone marker to define the boundary. When Umma later violated the agreement, King Enatum of Lagash defeated them and erected the Stele of the Vultures around 2450 BC, depicting soldiers marching in formation and vultures carrying off the remains of the defeated, its inscription re-establishing the boundary and cursing anyone who crossed it. That stele, unearthed by Ernest de Sarzeck in 1881 and now sitting in the Louvre, is one of the oldest surviving records of a formal political border anywhere on Earth. Two states arguing over exactly where one ends and the other begins. Sound familiar? But a border between two city-states still isn't quite a country. A country requires the idea that everyone inside a given line belongs together, even if they've never met one another. American Museum of Natural History anthropologist Robert Carneiro, in a 1970 paper published in Science, offered one influential theory for how states first emerged, which he called environmental circumscription. In places where fertile land sits boxed in by deserts, mountains, or oceans, growing populations end up competing for a fixed amount of farmland. When war breaks out under those conditions, the losers can't simply pack up and leave, because there's nowhere left to go, so they get absorbed into the winner's territory instead. Village absorbs village, chiefdom absorbs chiefdom, and eventually a state emerges. Carneiro pointed to the Nile Valley, hemmed in by desert on both sides. Coastal Peru, where narrow river valleys are pinched between the Andes and the Pacific, and the Tigris-Euphrates plain. All places where the earliest states arose independently, under exactly this kind of geographic pressure. In this reading, the country is partly a product of geography. People invented it because they were geographically trapped together and had to figure out how to live at a scale their brains were never designed for. The archaeological evidence for that trapping and for the violence that preceded any formal border is older than most people assume. At Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, a cemetery excavated by Fred Wendorf in the 1960s contained 59 skeletons dating back roughly 13,000 years, at least 24 of which showed clear signs of violent death, with stone projectile points still embedded in the bone. A 2021 reanalysis led by Isabelle Crevecoeur, published in Scientific Reports, confirmed these weren't casualties of one single battle. They were evidence of repeated, long-term intergroup violence over access to Nile resources during a period of severe drought. Near Lake Turkana in Kenya, A site called Nataruk, studied by a Cambridge team led by Marta Murazan-Lar and published in Nature in 2016, revealed 27 individuals roughly 10,000 years old, with crushed skulls, broken ribs, and obsidian arrow tips lodged in bone. Men, women, and at least one pregnant woman. This wasn't a duel. It was a massacre along a resource-rich lakeshore. People were fighting and dying over territory thousands of years before anyone thought to draw a line on a map and call it a border. The violence came first. The border came later. In Egypt, the Narmer palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis by James Quibell and Frederick Green in 1898 and dated to roughly 3100 BC, depicts King Narmer wearing the crowns of both Upper and Lower Egypt. One ruler, two lands, merged into a single political entity. That's the outline of a country, and it was established the way many countries since have been established, by force. Worth pausing on, though, not every early civilization built its country the same way. In the Indus Valley, between roughly 2600 and 1900 BC, a civilization spanning sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro covered an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Their cities were laid out on precise grids, their bricks standardized across sites more than 1,000 kilometers apart, all built to the exact same 1:4 dimensional ratio, with standardized weights, sophisticated drainage systems, and a writing system nobody has yet managed to decipher. And yet, as archaeologist Gregory Possehl argued in his 2002 book, The Indus Civilization, there's almost no evidence of palaces, monumental royal tombs, or any single autocratic king, no giant statues of rulers, no depictions of armies at all. University of Wisconsin archaeologist Jonathan Mark Carneiro has proposed that the Indus Valley may have functioned more like a confederation, governed not by a king, but by merchant guilds and ritual elites maintaining order through shared economic standards rather than military force. If that reading holds, and the debate is far from settled, then the Indus Valley is evidence that a country doesn't have to look like Egypt. It doesn't have to start with a conqueror. It can start with a shared system of weights and measures and a mutual agreement that everyone uses the same size brick, which, if you think about it, is really a kind of social contract written in clay. But even Egypt, even Mesopotamia, even the Indus Valley, even China, where the Shang dynasty was governing through oracle bone inscriptions and bronze ritual vessels by 1600 BC. These were kingdoms, empires, and confederations, not countries the way we understand the word today. A modern country requires one specific ingredient ancient empires simply didn't have: the sense, among ordinary people, and not just kings, that they belong to the same community. And that particular invention is shockingly recent. Anthropologist Elman Service, in his 1962 book Primitive Social Organization, outlined a framework still taught in anthropology classes today. Bands, tribes, chiefdoms, states, each a larger and more complex form of political organization than the last. But legal historian Henry Maine, writing back in 1861, pinned down the real shift more precisely, describing the transformation of human society from organization based on status, who you're related to, toward organization based on contract, where you live, what you owe. For most of human history, you belong to a clan. A country asks you to belong to a territory instead. That's not a small adjustment. That's a fundamental rewiring of how people understand themselves. Political philosopher Jean Bodin defined sovereignty in 1576 as the absolute and perpetual power of a state. Hugo Grotius, in 1625, laid the groundwork for international law. But the date most historians point to as the true birth of the modern nation-state system is October 24th, 1648, the Peace of Westphalia, two treaties signed at Munster and Osnabrück that ended the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War. They recognized the sovereignty of individual states, established that each state controls its own internal affairs, and set the template every international border negotiation has followed ever since. The system currently dividing the entire surface of Earth into 193 unmember states runs, at its structural core, on rules written 378 years ago. For a species that has existed for 300,000 years, the modern country isn't ancient. It's an afternoon. Westphalia gave the world its legal framework. The emotional framework came later. Political scientist Benedict Anderson, in his landmark 1983 book Imagined Communities, argued that a nation is precisely that, an imagined community, because the members of even the smallest nation will never personally know most of their fellow members, and yet in each person's mind lives an image of their shared belonging. You will never meet 99.99% of your fellow citizens. You share no personal bond with almost any of them. You probably disagree with most of them about most things, and yet you feel somehow that you and they are part of the same story. That feeling isn't natural. It was manufactured, and Anderson argued the machine that manufactured it was the printing press. Once books and newspapers began circulating in local vernacular languages instead of Latin, millions of people who had never met one another could suddenly read identical words at the same time in the same language. And that shared reading experience produced the feeling of belonging to a single community. Print made nations thinkable. Capitalism made them profitable. Sociologist Ernest Gellner made a strikingly similar argument the same year in Nations and Nationalism. Put more bluntly, nationalism doesn't awaken dormant nations. Nationalism invents them. The country isn't a natural fact. Its inhabitants simply discovered. It's a product manufactured through state education systems, standardized languages, and shared cultural symbols. When Italy unified in 1861, only about 2.5% of the population actually spoke Standard Italian. The rest spoke Sicilian, Neapolitan, Venetian, Piedmontese, and dozens of other regional languages, many mutually unintelligible. Massimo d'Azeglio reportedly summed it up. "We have made Italy. Now we must make Italians." The country came first. The people who supposedly defined it came after. The French Revolution made the whole mechanism explicit. Article 3 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, adopted August 26, 1789, declared that the principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation, not in the king, not in God, in the nation. That single sentence moved sovereignty off a throne and into an idea. And the levée en masse, the mass conscription decree of August 23, 1793, turned that idea into a weapon. For the first time in history, every citizen owed military service not to a lord, but to a nation. The country was no longer just somewhere you lived. It was something you could be asked to die for. Sometimes the borders themselves came from people who'd never set foot in the country at all. On May 16, 1916, British diplomat Mark Sykes and French diplomat François-Georges Picot drew lines across a map, dividing the Arab provinces of the collapsing Ottoman Empire into zones of British and French control. Lines that had almost nothing to do with the people actually living there, and yet became the borders of modern Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. In 1884, at the Berlin Conference organized by Otto von Bismarck, representatives from 14 European nations divided the African continent among themselves. Not a single African ruler was invited to attend. By 1914, roughly 90% of Africa was under European colonial control, carved into territories whose borders split ethnic groups in half and forced historic rivals into single administrative units. When those colonies gained independence through the 20th century, most kept the colonial borders exactly as drawn. The Organization of African Unity formally voted to preserve them in 1964, reasoning that any attempt to redraw them risked opening a chaos nobody could contain. The borders stayed, and the countries built on top of them are younger than most people assume. The United Nations had just 51 member states in 1945. Today, it has 193. In 1960 alone, 17 African nations gained independence. The newest widely recognized country on Earth is South Sudan, which became independent on July 9, 2011, after a referendum where 98.83% voted to separate from Sudan. The world hasn't stopped inventing countries. It may never stop. So here's the answer, in full. How did humans invent countries? They did it in layers. First, they settled down, tying their sense of identity to a specific piece of land and marking it with the bones of their ancestors. Then they grew grain, generating a surplus that could be stored, controlled, and taxed. Then they built walls to protect both the surplus and the people producing it. Then they outgrew the limits of personal relationships and invented writing, bureaucracy, and formal borders to manage populations no single human brain could ever track unaided. Then they fought wars that absorbed smaller groups into larger ones, especially in places where geography left the losing side nowhere left to run. Then they invented sovereignty, the legal idea that a state holds absolute authority within its own borders. Then they invented nationalism, the emotional idea that everyone inside those borders belongs to one community, even having never met. And then they drew lines on maps, sometimes carefully surveyed, sometimes settled with a ruler and a bottle of wine over lunch, and called the spaces in between countries. Was any of it inevitable? Almost certainly. Given agriculture, surplus, population growth, and the hard cognitive limits of the human brain, some form of large-scale political organization was always going to emerge. Carneiro's circumscription theory, Anderson's imagined communities, Gellner's account of industrial nationalism, different paths converging on the same basic conclusion. The likelihood that humans would eventually invent some version of a country, given the conditions that followed the Neolithic Revolution, looks close to certain. The specific shapes on the map, the specific names, the specific flags, those were accidents of geography, war, and colonial ambition. But the underlying concept that total strangers could be bound together by shared laws, shared language, and a shared fiction into one political unit was very likely coming no matter what. French philosopher Ernest Renan, in a lecture at the Sorbonne on March 11, 1882, titled "What is a Nation?", gave what may still be the sharpest answer of all. After dismissing race, language, religion, and geography as insufficient explanations, his conclusion was this: a nation's existence is a daily plebiscite. It exists because the people inside it choose, every single day, to act as though it exists. It isn't held together by soil or blood. It's held together by agreement, by collective memory, and, Renan added, by collective forgetting. Forgetting, I would even say historical error, he wrote, is an essential factor in the creation of a nation. You have to forget the conquests, the civil wars, the injustices that built the borders you now live inside, or the whole agreement quietly falls apart. Tonight, you'll go home to a country. You'll probably never think about it consciously. But that country, whatever it happens to be, is younger than pottery, younger than agriculture, younger, quite possibly, than the dog asleep on your couch. For 98% of human history, it simply didn't exist. And the only reason it exists now is that thousands of years ago, someone grew a field of wheat, someone counted the harvest, someone built a wall around it, and someone convinced the people living inside that wall that they were all, somehow, the same kind of people. That's what a country actually is. A story enough people believed for long enough that it became real.